What's up guys, this is Pink Across. We're going to go over the essential components of a good hazard stack team, look at some examples, then put it all together with a final team example. So first up, let's look at some spikes users. A spike user is essential to every hazard stack, and to clarify, a hazard stack is not about stacking every hazard. Typically, toxic spikes and sticky web are exempt from what would normally be considered hazard stacks. So what we're really talking about today is stealth rock and spikes. Now, these are some of the most common users I have here, and I'll go over and explain when you want to use them in a minute. But before we get into that, I also want to clarify that there are more Pokemon that get spikes, right? If we look spikes, you know, there are a lot more, right? Deoxyspeed, Meowscarada, Ogerpon, even Glamora, right? But this is about bulky hazard stack. That's what we're talking about today. So yes, there are a lot of other Pokemon that get spikes, but generally, if you're running a bulky hazard stack team, you don't want a Wellspring or a Meowscarada to be your spiker. I will make a video on offensive hazard stack in the future if you guys are interested in that as well. But let's take a look at these options. So Clodsire is a big one. Now, it's not the most common. Of all these, maybe other than Garchomp, it's probably the least common choice, but it is pretty solid. If you look at all the water types in the current metagame, having a water absorb Pokemon like Clodsire can be really, really nice. Dealing with threats like Wake, Primarina, and even with Terra Steel, it can actually shut down Wellspring pretty well. You can also run Unaware on this, and of course there are other options like Poison Jab, Clodsire as well, but especially for those bulkier, really even on the bulkier side of bulky hazard stacks, Clodsire is a great choice. Now, Gliscor is arguably the best spiker, and it typically, you can run a lot of sets. You can run Poison Jab, you can run Earthquake, you can run U-Turn. There are a ton of things Gliscor can run, but Protect, Spikes, and Knockoff are three that I think are really, really strong options. Terra, of course, usually something that helps deal with Wellspring. Gliscor, just incredibly strong Pokemon overall. You can run enough speed for modest Raging Bolt. Hitting 250 is pretty common. You can run Special Defense, physically defensive. Gliscor is very customizable and very strong. Now, Skarmory is nice too, because with Iron Defense, can help handle a lot of sweepers, notably Kingambit, while also setting spikes. So it's a pretty strong spike user as well. Tinglu, now I will say something benefit that Clodsire, Gliscor, and Skarmory all have. Clodsire has recovery, so it's okay with running boots. Skarmory is not that weak to hazards, so it doesn't need boots, only taking 12.5 from rocks. Gliscor, of course, not too weak to rocks either. Tinglu, though, it is weak to spikes, but you really don't want to run a boots Tinglu very often. It really does need leftovers to have any sense of longevity in a game. Now, you could pair it with a Wish Passer like Alomomola, but that is something to keep in mind when you're running Tinglu, is that on a boot spam team, it's a bit tough to pull off without a Wish Passer. And then lastly, we have Garchomp, and some people stack Stealth Rock on this as well over Rest and add Wish support. But Garchomp is pretty solid. It's definitely the most niche of all these spikes users, but it can work pretty well and can really punish physical hits hard. So if you're running an Alomomola hazard stack, I'd say you should really consider Garchomp. Alochomp is a very strong core. Now let's look at Stealth Rock. So something to note as we go through this list, it's very important that your Stealth Rock setter can either force Corviknight out or you have a switch into Gholdengo, because if your hazard stack gets defogged easily by Corv, that's not a very good hazard stack. So all the things that we just went over that can set spikes can also set Stealth Rock. I personally think running Stealth Rock on Skarmory and Gliscor is a bit of a waste with how good they are at setting spikes, but Clodsire, Tinglu, and Garchomp can all use it fairly well. And now to go over some really good ones. So Clefable is great as a Stealth Rock user on hazard stack because of its Magic Guard, making it a really, really nice absorber of knockoff, and it can also provide Wish support, which is cool. Now, only 95 HP, so it's not like an Alomomola Wish, but it's a decent amount of health. Still good to have a Wish Passer. Garganacl is a great one because, as I mentioned, Corviknight, right? So defog Corviknight is not super common, but it's on around 20% of teams and a lot of bulkier teams as well, which getting Stealth Rock up is very, very important for. So this Garganacl with Salt Cure can force out Corviknight and get up rocks every time, which is great. Because if you have a hazard stack team that can pressure Corviknight, you're not as obligated to run Gholdengo. And of course, Garganacl, just a very strong Pokemon in general. Blissey, not super common, but you see it sometimes. And over the course of a long game, it can get up Stealth Rock on Corviknight by fishing for Thunder Wave Paras as you switch out. Landorus, not super common on bulky Hazard Stack, but I do think it is worth mentioning. It can work with Wish support, and you can also run sets to give it a little bit more longevity. You can run like Leftovers Protect on Landorus, which can lend it some longevity as well. Now, Great Tusk, not a super common Stealth Rock user, mostly because most Hazard Stacks just opt to do away with removal and go boot spam, but Tusk is definitely still usable, and it can provide a little bit of offensive firepower for a bulky team that might not have a lot of immediate power, something to deal with a threat like Raging Bolt, for example. And not super common, but I figured I'd mention it with the rise of Darkrai, Tinkaton can actually be a pretty decent Stealth Rock setter. It can also get up Stealth Rock on Mold Breaker on Magic Bounce Pokemon, which is pretty cool, not a huge factor. But walls Darkrai pretty well, really annoying support with T-Wave Knock, and similarly to Blissey, with the combination of Thunder Wave, Knockoff, and fishing for Paras, you can indeed get off rocks on Corviknight without the need for a Gholdengo in an extended game versus, say, a stall team. So now we've gone over Stealth Rock and Spikes, essential components of a Hazard Stack, but what about removal? Isn't removal something every team needs? Well, not exactly, and especially not exactly if you're running a Hazard Stack team. So removal is actually very rare on Hazard Stack. Generally, they like to run a heavy-duty boots spam team, but when you do use it, it must be Rapid Spin. Now, there are some niche Rapid Spin users you can use. Maybe you can make Quaquaval work with some weird specially defensive set to help against Darkrai. I'm not saying it's impossible, but generally speaking, these are going to be your 3 spin users. Excadrill, particularly, you only want to really use that if you have a Tyranitar or a Sand Setter on your team, and the most common will definitely be Great Tusk and Iron Treads. Great Tusk being the stronger spinner of the two, but depending on your team composition, maybe you'd rather have an Iron Treads. Really just depends, but typically you will want one of these two. And the nice thing is they also do get Knockoff, which of course Hazard Stack really likes, but as I said, most Hazard Stack will not run any of these Pokemon and will opt to just run a bunch of heavy-duty boots. Okay, so now you've set up your Stealth Rock, you've got your Spikes. How do you prevent your opponent from removing it? Well, first let's address the by far best removal blocker that competitive Pokemon has ever seen, and that is Gholdengo. Now, this is a very, very strong blocker of removal. It prevents Defog, Rapid Spin, and Mortal Spin all in one slot. No other spin blocker or removal blocker in history has been able to do that, so Gholdengo definitely deserves respect. Despite what you might think, though, I actually do not believe Gholdengo is the best spin blocker. So one reason for that is if we look at Rapid Spin, right? We just saw the 3 best and most common ones. They are all ground types. That means Gholdengo is going to be taking a lot of damage if you get red. And they also, Tusk and Treads run Knockoff very, very frequently, which is not great either. Now, the good thing, though, Gholdengo can run Terra Ghost, and this might seem odd initially. You think, well, this is a defensive Gholdengo. Why are we running an offensive Terra type? So it's actually not. Because you Terra Ghost, you get rid of that Steel type and can allow yourself to resist and actually tank Great Tusk Headlong Rush pretty effectively, as well as anything an Iron Treads can dish out, and Knockoff is not doing much to you either. Now, you can also run other Terra types, Terra Flying. This is kind of just the optimal for spin blocking. If you're really, really set on spin blocking, I would say defensive Terra Ghost is the way to go. But Gholdengo is actually not, as I said, I think the best spin blocker. Defog being pretty uncommon, a lot of people have opted to just run a Stealth Rock setter that can pressure Corviknight efficiently, things like Garganacl or things like Heatran, for example. And then go with a different ghost type. So let's go with another spin blocker. Dragapult is not a fantastic spin blocker, but it is a fantastic Pokemon, and that's the really big deal. Hazard Stack, like every team in Gen 9, well, every team that's not hyper offense can struggle to fill slots with important things that it needs, struggles to develop a defensive core, struggle to get in priority speed. So the fact that Dragapult does a lot of role compression, offering something that can help against Darkrai, help against Zamazenta, help against sweepers like Dragonite, while also being a spin blocker, is really what makes it such a popular choice on Hazard Stack. So it's not that it's the best spin blocker, but it's that it provides a lot of other good things for a team while also technically spin blocking. Now, Pecharunt and Sinistcha are kind of in the same boat here. They're a bit odd, but they're really, really bulky. Now, you kind of run Terra Ghost on Pecharunt for the same reason you run it on Gholdengo. It allows you to take Headlong Rush really well. Now, interestingly enough, Pecharunt can actually tank pretty well Headlong Rush from non-offensive Tusk. And you're taking really not much at all from Earthquake from defensive Tusk because of this thing's insane defense. And of course, moves like Malignant Chain, Recover, Parting Shot, Hex can be pretty good support for a team. So Pecharunt and Sinistcha are both very strong spin blockers, the stronger of the two being Sinistcha because it is not weak to ground moves from Great Tusk, Treads, and Excadrill. This thing is probably, if you have a rocker that punishes Corviknight, the best spin blocker. Now, it's a little bit weird to fit, though. You may look at things like Gholdengo and Dragapult. They provide a lot to the team. Sinistcha, what does it provide to the team? Not quite as much. That's the thing. It's a really, really great spin blocker. There's nothing that blocks Rapid Spin as well, but it is a little bit hit or miss. This Calm Mindset is not providing consistent utility. It's not providing speed. It's not walling a ton of things reliably, so that is kind of the downside, but it's a wonderful, wonderful spin blocker. And as I said, the current metagame, there's a lot of pressure, right, to put certain things on the team to fit things like priority and faster Pokemon and answering to certain threats. So sometimes people will be unable to fit a Ghost when building a Hazard Stack. And is that okay? Generally not. It's not ideal. But if your team is really suited for long-term games and can afford for your opponent to remove hazards once or twice and you can reset them, sometimes it's okay to have your spin blocker be a Terra Ghost Pokemon. Now, I don't want you guys to use this as a crutch. Generally, it's really, really good to have a real Ghost, but some of the best at doing this are Clefable and Alomomola, I would say. Clefable, because it's a very nice switch in to Tusk, can threaten it very, very well. And also get up Wish Passing, and also with Terra Ghost, it deals with Zamazenta too. Alomomola, similarly, with Regenerator especially, it can come in on a lot of hits and take quite a beating and still be okay with coming into Spin Block, and with Terra Ghost, it also does shut down Zamazenta too with Scald, which is a really nice side bonus. So you can run Terra Ghost on quite a few things, but probably these two and maybe Ting-Lu would be some of the strongest. But as I said, generally you do want a real spin blocker, a natural Ghost type. Alright, so now you've got your Stealth Rock up, you've got your Spikes up, and you've prevented your opponent from removing hazards. But how do you take advantage of these hazards when there are so many heavy-duty boots Pokemon in the tier? So that is why you need a strong knockoff user. And what makes a knockoff user a strong one? Well, let's look at knockoff. Is any knockoff Pokemon going to do? Will a Clefable be a good? No, it won't be. How about a Ogerpon Wellspring? Yes, that's a pretty strong one. How about Roaring Moon? No. Now you may wonder, by strong knockoff user, I don't just mean having the strongest knockoff. Roaring Moon has one of these strongest knockoffs available in OU. But what I mean by a strong knockoff user in this context is that it beats the typical knock absorbers. And those three are Corv, Gliscor, and Clefable. And you can kind of throw in Skarmory under the umbrella of Corviknight as well. What makes Darkrai, even though it doesn't have a super strong knockoff, really good as a knockoff user is because Sludge Bomb, Ice Beam, Dark Pulse take care of Gliscor, Clefable, and Corviknight. So this Darkrai basically can deal with the main knockoff absorbers and things that normally switch into Darkrai, things like Blissey, think maybe a Clodsire, maybe even weirder things like, say, Primarina, Okidogi, Ting-Lu, whatever. Those are hating getting knocked off, and then they'll be taking the full force of the hazards of your team. Deoxys, not a super strong one since it doesn't do great against Corviknight, and especially defensive. Clefable can wall sets like this, but it can be a pretty decent knockoff user and definitely can put a lot of pressure on your opponent. One of the best being Swords Dance Gliscor. This thing definitely shreds other Gliscor and deals pretty well with Clefable as well, of course. The one thing it does struggle with is Corviknight and Skarmory, the Iron Defense sets. That being said, you just have a Pokemon on your team that takes advantage of them. If they're Defog, they're probably not Iron Defense, so you can beat Defog sets by just stacking up Swords Dance, and if they are Iron Defense, you just have something in the back that takes advantage of them, something like, say, a Dragapult, which can come in and be immune to Body Press and threaten with things like Wisp and Hex and Dragon Darts and all that. Also, just a very, very good Pokemon into bulkier teams since it can't be statused. Iron Valiant is another great one. Its ability to run mixed sets with knockoff makes it almost impossible to switch into long-term with hazards. If you think about typical switch-ins to Iron Valiant, really nothing is going to be able to take this on long-term. I mean, imagine, say, something like a Toxapex. You knock it off the first time it comes in, then the next time you probably kill it with depending on the set, a Moonblast into a Thunderbolt, for example. And you also generally want to run Tera Fairy with max special attack investment on these sets because you do want to beat those good knock absorbers. Clefable, Gliscor don't really care about being knocked, so you Tera Fairy Moonblast and you can two-shot almost all of them. Meowscarada is a particularly famous one. I like Tera Fire on these guys just to deal with Moltres, but some people like offensive Tera types as well. And you run Triple Axle, which can deal pretty well with Gliscor and does a very good chunk to Clefable. Flower Trick as well, does quite well there. And you may say, well, this isn't beating Corviknight, and you're kind of right, but Triple Axle will do a good amount, and with you turning on Stealth Rock, over the course of a long game, you can definitely beat Corviknight down with this. Wellspring is a pretty good one as well, so it's obviously incredibly powerful, and whatever was switching in on it is not going to like taking a knockoff with full hazards up. Now, that being said, notice everything else on this list has had heavy-duty boots. Wellspring cannot run that, so if you're going to run Wellspring as your knock Pokemon, and don't get me wrong, it's great at knocking off, you're going to need a Tusk. You're going to need to be one of the hazard stacks that does not spam heavy-duty boots, but instead goes the Tusk route, and that can be sometimes not the most fun thing. Weavile, another really strong one. Obviously, with Tera Ice Triple Axle, you're dealing fairly well with Corviknight and Clefable and Gliscor, and you can knock everything else. Now, the one thing it does struggle with, even with full hazards up, is Alomomola, so you'll need to account for that in your building. Ogerpon, another classic. This guy with SD, Tera Grass, Ivy Cudgel can do pretty well into Gliscor and Clefable, and it can U-turn on Corviknight and slowly chip it down. Does struggle a little bit with Corviknight, but overall it's a pretty decent knockoff, strong knockoff user. Now for some more niche ones, we've got Tornadus. The main one it struggles with is Gliscor, especially if especially defensive. There are workarounds to deal with that. You can run, for instance, Nasty Plot over U-turn, making this a very, very strong against putting pressure on bulkier teams. Scizor is another interesting one. Not a super common one, but with Swords Dance, you can boost up and threaten Corviknight and Clefable and Gliscor pretty well. Generally, you don't want to run this on a bulkier hazard stack because it doesn't last super long, but it can help against your improve your hyper offense matchup, and with Wish support, you can make it more consistent against bulkier teams. Mamoswine is one I think really deserves respect as well. Being able to Tera Ice Icicle Crash, fish for flinches against things like Corviknight, and obviously it totally crashes through Gliscor and Clefable, and being able to knock otherwise is really, really strong. And in the current metagame, I just think Mamoswine doesn't really get enough respect. Deals pretty well with Raging Bolt, hits Roaring Moon with really strong priority, and even with Thick Fat and a combination of an ability like, say, Tera Fairy, you can actually switch in and have it deal with Gouging Fire, which is a pretty cool little tech as well. Hoopa Unbound, once again, a kind of a more niche one, but pretty good. With knockoff Psychic Noise, Thunderbolt, Drain Punch, if this thing is knocking off things with hazards up, you are in good shape. Psychic Noise is pretty well shutting down Clefable and Gliscor, and you can really, really do a good job otherwise with things like Drain Punch for Kingambit, Thunderbolt for Corviknight. Overall, just a really, really strong knockoff user. The downside of a lot of these more niche picks being that they don't provide as much utility, whether defensively or with speed, as a lot of these other stronger, more common options, but still deserves some respect. And Okidogi, this has been getting more popular lately. Pretty good into Darkrai, which is one of its main benefits, but also really effective against Kingambit. And with bulk up sets, it can really, really threaten and honestly use as setup fodder a lot of the time. Things like Clefable, Gliscor, and Corviknight. Your opponent will be able to switch into something that threatens at one point, but you can knock it off. Things like, say, Zapdos being a common answer, that hates getting knocked off. Things like a Galarian Slowking, right, trying to come in and hit a Psychic move. It's not going to like a boosted knockoff. So overall, Okidogi, a little bit more of a strange pick and definitely not as strong of a knockoff user as some of these earlier things like Iron Valiant, Meowscarada, Darkrai, but it's still an option. When you have a team that produces long games like Bulky Hazard Stack often does, your opponent is probably going to be free to set hazards as you set hazards. Since you're probably running a heavy-duty boot spam hazard stack, it's important to have a knockoff absorber so you don't lose this war of attrition. Now, this Pokemon needs to have two qualities. It needs to be good at taking the actual hit of knockoff, as well as being okay with losing its item. This doesn't describe very many Pokemon, so we have a very short list of good knockoff absorbers. First one being Clefable. Obviously, Magic Guard kind of has its own built-in heavy-duty boots, and it takes knockoff very well, right? It resists dark, and it's fairly physically bulky, and it just happens to match up well into a lot of the common knockoff absorbers, things like Iron Valiant, Meowscarada, Darkrai. Now, it doesn't match up fantastically into those because it is still a Clefable, right? These stats aren't incredible, and OU is full of really high base stat total Pokemon, but it is still definitely one of the top knockoff absorbers. Corviknight being fantastic as well. A lot of sets you can run on this. Brave Bird, Iron Defense, Defog sets, whatever. Generally, you don't want to run Defog on a hazard stack, but it is a very, very effective knockoff absorber. So that's a good one as well. Skarmory, similarly, basically just does what Corv does. Really good knockoff absorber. The combination of being flying, so it's immune to almost all types, immune to all hazards, and also having that steel type so it doesn't take the typical 25% from rocks that flying types do, makes all three of these really effective. Gliscor, I would say without a doubt, the best knockoff absorber. Once it gets that Toxic Orb established with Protect, it really doesn't care anymore. You can knock it off, you can do whatever, it doesn't mind. So very, very strong here. The one part of Gliscor that doesn't make it as great as maybe some others, or some could argue it's not the best, is because it is still 4 times weak to ice, and a lot of the best knockoff users do have ice coverage. Things like Meowscarada, Weavile, Darkrai. I will say though, with Terra, you can deal with that pretty effectively still, which does make you vulnerable to spikes if you switch into, say, a water type or something. But overall, Gliscor can still shut down a fair amount of knockoff users and make it quite effective in that role. Now, another one, very niche, but I figured I should bring up some Sticky Hold users. A Hydrapple here, heavy duty boots and Sticky Hold, so your item cannot be removed, is pretty nice. And with Terra Steel, it can take on a lot of common knockoff users. Now, something that's worth noting is that you do have to Terra this often to be a good knockoff absorber. It really does not enjoy taking ice moves, and a lot of knockoff absorbers do have that. Iron Valiant can pressure this. Just a lot of knockoff Pokemon really honestly kind of shred Hydrapple until you Terra, which is not a great situation to be in. So that's why I don't consider this one of the best, but it can work on very certain, very, very bulky, typically, teams. Gastrodon as well. Once again, I really don't advise it. I don't think it's very good, but in niche situations it can work. And then an honorable mention here, Regenerator Pokemon. So because you have Regenerator, it's not nearly as good as Magic Guard, but that regen can kind of be as if you're ignoring hazards as you come in, because you can Regenerator off all that damage from Stealth Rock and Spikes. Not ideal, but sometimes in Gen 9 you've got to go with things that are not ideal because you can't have everything you want on a team, right? So maybe you can, on occasion, use physically defensive Regenerator Pokemon as your knockoff Absorber. Now let's take a look at some common supporting Pokemon. So these don't fulfill any particular role on Hazard Stack, but they often find their way onto Hazard Stack teams just because of that they work really well with the playstyle or happen to work well with a lot of the Pokemon that are typically on Hazard Stack. One is Skeledirge. So this is often a really good Pokemon to have when you're running a main spin blocker of something like a Terra Ghost, Clefable, or Alomomola. Skeledirge is a terrible spin blocker, especially because the best sets do run specially defensive Wisp. You're getting really destroyed by Knockoff, you're getting really destroyed by Earthquake, so it's kind of a terrible spin blocker in general, but it can be there in a pinch, which is why I recommend you run it with another spin blocker or something like a Terra Ghost, Alo, or Clefable. But the reason it's good on Hazard Stack is mostly just because Hazard Stack being slow-paced and often a little bit and often can struggle against more offensive setup heavy playstyles. Skeledirge can stop that with Unaware, and being specially bulky and having Wisp can cover a very wide range of sweepers with Terra. So it's kind of just nice to have that button sitting in the back that you can Terra and get out of any scary sweeper situation. Galarian Slowking, really good common boots user, really nice specially defensive support, and oftentimes as I was going through those knockoff users, I said, well, it struggles against this. Like, say, Weavile, right? Really great knockoff Absorber, but it can't really deal with all of Momola. Even with full hazards up, knockoff is doing like 20, you're not doing enough. Well, that's where Slowking comes in. With Future Sight, you take your knockoff user and bring it to the next level. There is nothing that can deal with full hazards, a knockoff user, and a Future Sight. So you basically ensure against bulkier teams that you're going to crack them open. Kingambit's a Kingambit. It's really good. It enjoys Hazard Chip. It deals well with a lot of those sweepers. Kind of the same thing I said about Dirge. Having a strong Sucker Punch can help limit a lot of those setup sweepers that typically threaten bulkier, more passive Hazard Stack teams. So Kingambit's just a nice Pokemon to have. Mandibuzz, kind of a similar situation to Skeledirge in the sense that it can really deal with a lot of setup, especially physical setup. Just being so incredibly bulky and having Iron Defense, Foul Play, and Toxic, really nice thing for Hazard Stack to have. Gouging Fire, just with its incredible defense, and it really enjoys Hazard Chip, and can also run Dragon Tail sets. So these have been more popular lately, and it fits really well on Hazard Stack because you got a Pokemon that provides decent defensive utility, and can also kind of phase, which of course Hazard Stack loves. And the next one would be Zamazenta. Typically Roar sets, although a lot of Zamazenta sets can work well on Hazard Stack. Kind of in the same light of Mandibuzz, can really help against those physical setup sweepers, and especially with Roar, really does enjoy hazard support. Here's an example I made, a fairly standard Hazard Stack which shows some common Pokemon effectively formed. Now, I want to emphasize that standard is not necessarily optimal, even with a playstyle with such well-defined roles as bulky Hazard Stack. So remember to be creative and find unique Pokemon that can satisfy the roles of Hazard Stack, and it might be the innovation that takes your team to the next level. Now that being said, let's take a look at this standard example, just to give you an idea of how all these moving parts work together. So, starting with my Spikes user, I have a Skarmory here. Now, the one thing I mentioned about Skarmory is that it only has Body Press, meaning it is really, really weak to Ghost types. So, especially Gholdengo, which is why we see Kingambit here, but also Dragapult, especially Wisp sets of Dragapult, are generally really rough for Skarmory, so I decided to pair it with the Stealth Rock user of Garganacl. Especially with Terra Water, this can shut down Gholdengo, and it's a fantastic switch into Dragapult. You can run leftovers. I think Heavy Duty Boots is pretty good as well, really depends on preference, but just because Garganacl often stays in for so many turns at once, you can kind of switch it around and see what works better in practice. Now, this also pressures Corviknight, which is great. So having Salt Cure means that this team can effectively pressure Corviknight without the need for a Gholdengo, which allows a spin blocker of Dragapult. So this, although not the best spin blocker, this team's pretty bulky, could get up hazards multiple times if it really needed to. And this also gives the team some speed, which is very, very nice. And also works quite well with this next Pokemon, SD Gliscor. So this is going to be my knockoff user of the team. SD, Protect, Knockoff, Facade. Now, this is a really strong Gliscor set. What walls this long term? Pretty much Unaware Pokemon, Corviknight, and Skarmory. And what do we say Corviknight and Skarmory are weak to? Dragapult. So that's why these two are a really strong core. Gliscor, the only thing that really can deal with it and is okay with this thing setting up is Corviknight and Skarmory with Iron Defense, and then you can go into Dragapult to take advantage of those. Now as support, I have Galarian Slowking here, mostly as a Fairy Resist and as a pivot. Now, we do technically have Skarmory, but that is not a real Fairy Resist at all, if we're being honest. And the rest of the team is fairly passive, doesn't deal well with setup, and is a little bit weak to Gholdengo. So having Kingambit as the last slot gives us a really strong priority move, some setup to be threatening in the back, and just some aid against those more offensive teams that threaten to overwhelm this bulky core better suited for long-term games. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please subscribe, like, and leave a comment if you did, and I'll see you guys next time.